the Russian army faced very big problems. The Russian commander opened fire against his own soldiers. This situation has resonated all over the world. He began to get very nervous about this situation with the soldier in the Russian army. After that, some groups in the Russian army began to revolt. Putin, on the other hand, was surprised at what to do. While the confusion in the Russian army was growing, the decisions taken by Russian President Vladimir Putin stunned the whole world. In the last days of the Ukraine-Russia war, the Russian army began to experience very big problems. The main reason for this was the policies that Putin followed. Putin has lost approximately 250,000 Russian soldiers since the beginning of the war because of these policies he has followed. The Russian army, on the other hand, has begun to show great reactions to these losses. The Russian army is no longer able to shelter on Ukrainian territory because the successful operations organized by the Ukrainian army have thoroughly cornered the Russian soldiers. Thanks to these moves, Ukraine has seized the dominance in the region. The biggest reason why Ukraine was so successful was the support that came to Ukraine. Thanks to the HIMARS sent by the United States to the Ukrainian army had dealt a major blow to the Russian soldiers. Thus, the HIMARS also fired decently at the Russian convoys. After that, the Ukrainian army seized the dominance in the region. At the same time, following Putin's threats, the countries that are on the side of Ukraine have increased the embargoes they have imposed on Russia. Putin began to lose both the territory he occupied and the ammunition he had. After these recent events, the soldiers in the Russian army began to revolt. In the face of the successful operations of the Ukrainian army, the Russian soldiers had no strength left to resist. After that, the Russian soldiers were surprised what to do. The soldiers in the Russian army no longer wanted to fight. That's why Russian soldiers started making plans to surrender to the Ukrainian army. But soon the Kremlin became aware of this situation, and he immediately took action. Putin has increased the authority he has given to headquarters commanders to prevent this situation. However, Putin's move has caused even more confusion. The Russian soldiers were tired of Putin's harsh reactions. A group of Russian soldiers who did not want to put up with this anymore tried to escape from the headquarters. Although the Russian soldiers knew that these moves were very dangerous, they did not stop running. The soldiers who learned that Putin would give life sentences to soldiers fleeing the war decided to surrender to the Ukrainian army. But Russian soldiers experienced the worst-case scenario, and they were caught by the headquarters commander before they could surrender. The headquarters, located near the Zaporizhia region, was of highly critical importance for both Russia and Ukraine. 6. Soldiers in this area were restless because the area was too crowded and tried to escape. But when a lot of problems came in succession, things got really complicated. That's why the Russian soldiers began to wait for the most appropriate time. Seizing the appropriate time, Russian soldiers began to flee towards the Ukrainian region. But on the way, they met the headquarters commanders. Although the Russian soldiers tried to climb the barbed wire to escape, when the Russian commander realized this, he started shooting towards the soldiers. After the attack of Russian commanders, 6 Russian soldiers lost their lives. These recent events have caused great confusion in the Russian army. While the operations organized by the Ukrainian army have already confused the Russian commander's behavior in this way has brought the Russian army to its feet. After this incident, while the whole world was waiting for this commander to be punished, Putin almost gave the commander an award. According to the report published after that, in order to maintain military discipline and prevent an increase in panic among personnel, the decapitated Russian soldiers who had moved to escape, he wrote. After this published report, the whole world has seen how much the Russian army has declined. And after all this tension, it was not yet known what kind of move the Russian army would make. But the morale of the soldiers in the Russian army had fallen quite a lot. However, soldiers who could not even meet their basic needs began to question why they were fighting. Ukraine, on the other hand, was preparing to take advantage of this opportunity to make much more critical moves. If the Ukrainian army continues its mind-boggling operations, the Russian army would fall into a much worse situation. And the Ukrainian army managed to turn the war in its favor. The actions of the Ukrainian army in recent days have completely changed the course of the war. The Russian army began to revolt after successive defeats. Dekainir. This uprising of the Russian army became the agenda all over the world. And now the Ukrainian army has been ahead in every field. Instead of engaging in heated clashes with the Russian army, Ukraine began to make strategic moves. Thanks to these strategic moves, a very big blow was dealt to the Russian army. One of the blows that the Russian army suffered the most damage was the destruction of its ammunition and weapons. If the Russian army did not get itself in order as soon as possible, it would suffer much greater damage. However, the Russian soldiers began to find various excuses to withdraw from the region and stop the war. But Putin, who wanted to prevent this situation, gave Rosgvardia a task as a precaution. The purpose of these National Guards, assigned to prevent disturbances caused by soldiers in the Russian army, was very different. This group, which was founded in 2016 before the war began, was established to prevent anti-regime demonstrations by the Russian people. But when the Russian army also began to rebel repeatedly, Putin put Rosgvardia into operation, DEK, and Putin began to make plans to break the resistance in the army. Thanks to these upheavals, the soldiers in the Ukrainian army were feeling better mentally every day. After these developments, the comments made by war analysts have resonated all over the world. According to the comments of war analysts, it has now become a matter of time for the Ukrainian army to win the war. One of the most important reasons for this was the support given by the United States and Europe to the Ukrainian army. Thanks to these supports, the Ukrainian army was continuing to increase its strength every day. However, almost all the soldiers in the Ukrainian army were fighting willingly and voluntarily. At the same time, the morale of the Russian soldiers was quite low, while the morale and motivation of the Ukrainian soldiers were quite high. If the Ukrainian army acted in coordination in this way, it would completely expel Russian soldiers on its territory very soon. Even the Ukrainian army could have advanced the war to the Russian borders. Because thanks to his successful operations, he ensured that a large part of the Russian soldiers gave up. In the face of this situation, it was a matter of curiosity how Putin would follow the path. But instead of correcting this situation, Putin began to threaten countries that support Ukraine. While the support to Ukraine increased after these threats, the violence increased during the embargoes imposed on Russia. After that, the Ukrainian army has added another one to its advantages. Thus, while the confusion in the Russian army was increasing, a group of soldiers in the Russian army was offering various excuses not to fight. Because the Russian soldiers did not want to fight in vain because they thought they would lose the war. At the same time, Putin was in such a difficult situation that he was still making his soldiers use Soviet-era weapons in the war. At this rate, it was quite difficult for the Russian army to achieve any success. As if it wasn't enough that Putin made the Soviet Union use weapons, he continued to follow the policies of 40 years ago. After Putin's mistake, the Ukrainian army began to establish dominance in most regions. Since the Russian army had no opportunity to make any moves, Putin was obliged to order his troops to move into a defensive position. The Russian soldiers, on the other hand, were not thinking of returning to the fronts they had abandoned. Thus, Putin would fall into a much more difficult situation. The Ukrainian army has moved to organize an operation to deal a major blow to Russian soldiers. Putin could have risked losing his power after this coup,